Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm William Crow. I am the director of Lehigh University Art Galleries and professor of practice in the Department of Art, Architecture, and Design. And what a pleasure to see all of you here this evening for this very special event. I'm going to be brief with my remarks, but I really want to say how wonderful it is to see all of you here in person in this room. I see students and faculty and staff and neighbors and friends who have traveled from across the region to be here. And that is really what a museum does. A museum is a convener that brings people together so that we can have great experiences with works of art and also where we can explore big ideas together. Museums are places where we can not only observe, but where we can discuss and question and hypothesize and even debate. They are places where we can express our views and hear diverse perspectives, and perhaps where we can even expand our skills and our comfort level with listening to others and understanding others. If you aren't as familiar with Lehigh University Art Galleries, I hope that you'll get to know us. We are a free public museum with over 18,000 works of art from across the world. Paintings, drawings, sculpture, photography, video. These are all primary sources for teaching, learning, and research, and of course, enjoyment. To begin our evening, it's my great pleasure to introduce Lehigh's president, Joe Helbley, who will provide a welcome, and that will be followed by current Lehigh undergraduate student, Aviela Maynard, who will introduce the artist. After we hear from artist Shimon Attie, I hope that you will join us next door in LUAG's main and lower galleries for a reception. So thank you all so much for coming this evening, and now please join me in welcoming President Joe Helbley.
Thank you, William. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me all right? How great to see you all here this evening. What a wonderful event this is. Lehigh University has a long history as a maker place and a maker space, which for me is synonymous with being a creative space and a creative organization. Our university was founded in 1865 by Asa Packer, who was a business leader, entrepreneur, and I'm also told a carpenter and a boat builder. And it was founded as a place to educate the builders and the makers, the engineers of the day in the late 19th century. But to do so as part of a broader education that intentionally included the classics and through early curricula in drawing and painting, arguably included the arts from our founding and our foundation. Lehigh's been a pragmatic place for much of our history, focused on rolling up our sleeves to address the challenges at hand, but never doing so blindly. Doing so in full collaboration with the community whose problem we were trying to solve. Doing so by understanding that the engineering mindset and the business mindset that characterized Lehigh in those early days were not the only mindsets. Understanding that there are, in fact, different contexts and very different ways of seeing. Lehigh's support for and celebration of art and the arts and their association with the technical, with the engineered world, has not only been a part of Lehigh's DNA, it's been part of our organizational structure seemingly forever. Lehigh is 157 years old. Lehigh University's art galleries are in fact approaching a century of history on their own, which I think is wonderful and remarkable. Now, it might seem to some audiences, certainly not to this audience, counterintuitive that a university that has had such a long association with engineering and technology has had such a long-standing commitment to the arts. But to me, that linkage, that connection is absolutely and abundantly clear. Each of these endeavors asks us to contemplate the unseen and to imagine the new. Each asks us first to understand why, and then by emphasizing the creative, dares us to ask, why not? And it isn't just our permanent campus community that encourages us to think and to ask these questions. Visitors Coming to us through programs like the Artist in Residence program expand our perspectives and push us to see ourselves, to interrogate ourselves, to question ourselves in new ways. Shimon Attie's work that we will hear about and witness and see and experience this evening expands our thinking about community and how it shapes who we are. For me personally, it dares us to ask questions about the meaning of space and place and about intersectionality. It asks us to consider not only how people can transform a place, but how a place can transform a people. The program allowing us to bring Shimon Attie to Lehigh is a critical and unique part of a residential college experience, and Lehigh is grateful to the Horger family for the endowment that supports the Artist in Residence program. As William said, campus art museums are convening spaces. Just look around you, as he said in his brief opening remarks, at the community that's assembled here, and are critical to our ability to bring campus and local community together, to bring diverse voices, perspectives, and expertise together. In my 1 year here as president, I've spoken often of the interdisciplinary imperative for this university and for higher education, the need for us to expose students to different ways of seeing, different ways of asking and answering questions that come not just from different disciplines, but from vastly different fields and even different colleges. This exhibition has brought together students, faculty, staff, and community members from a broad range of disciplines, from art and from history, from social sciences, from technology and digital production, fostering exactly the kind of collaboration, radical interdisciplinary collaboration, that is so critical to nurturing the creative spark, so critical to getting us to ask and answer questions in new ways. So it's a pleasure and a privilege for me to be here with you this evening, and a pleasure and privilege for Lehigh to host this exhibition. It's now my pleasure to introduce Lehigh student Aviella Maynard, a graphic design and product design major, who will introduce our distinguished visiting artist. Aviella?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Aviella Maynard, and I'm a current sophomore in Shimon Attie's fall semester course, The Arts of Sites and Communities. Within the course thus far, we've been exploring what it means to create art about and within spaces that aren't solely ours. Our culminating works will involve large-scale group projects that will be on display for both Bethlehem residents and the Lehigh community to experience. As a product and graphic design major who hasn't had much experience with collaborative, site-specific, and installation art, it has been an absolute pleasure and privilege to learn from someone who's an expert in the area. Established in 2016, the Theater U Horger Endowed Artist in Residence for the Performing and Visual Arts was created through an estate gift from the late Horger in order to bring visiting artists to the university. A visiting artist is in residence each year, rotating among the departments of music, theater, and art, architecture, and design. Shimon Attie is the 6th artist in residence and AAD's 2nd. Born in Los Angeles and raised in New York, artist Shimon Attie began his career in Berlin in the early 1990s, where he projected photographs of pre-war Jewish street life onto the buildings where the images were originally taken. For more than 3 decades, he has explored how contemporary media may be used to reimagine relationships between space, time, place, and identity, and to animate urban space with imagery of its lost histories, marginalized communities, and speculative futures. His practice extends across video, photography, and immersive multimedia projects in museums and galleries to site-specific installations for public spaces in Berlin, Copenhagen, New York, Rome, San Francisco, the Israel-Palestine border, and other locations. He is shown in group and solo exhibitions around the world, including at the Museum of Modern Art and Jewish Museum in New York, the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington, the Institute of Contemporary Art in Boston, the St. Louis Art Museum, the Wexner Center of the Arts, the National Museum of Wales, and the Centre Georges Pompidou. He's a Guggenheim Fellow and Rome Prize recipient, and holds the Lee Krasner Award from the Pollock Krasner Foundation. He's represented by Jack Shainman Gallery in New York. Please join me in welcoming artist Shimon Attie.
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you so much for coming this evening. One of the first things that came up is the issue of acknowledgments and who to thank. And the problem with such a project is once you start, there's no way to stop, because nearly 100 people were involved in the creation of Starstruck. From professors and students at Lehigh to many different community members of every stripe that you can imagine. So what I wanted, and that to the breadth and the potential of doing large projects of this nature, that they bring in a wide variety of community, they build community, and they also have the potential to hopefully create meaningful responses and experiences for a community. Having said all that, in front of, did I lose the mic? No? Okay. Having said all that, in front of the gallery, there's a monitor as you enter into the Lehigh University Art Gallery. And on that monitor are all 100 people listed who I would like to thank. So that's where they are listed there. One thing I would like to do is to call out and thank Lehigh University and the College of Art, Architecture, and Design for being such welcoming hosts. And I've worked with a lot of different institutions all over the world, basically. And at Lehigh, I have found a eagerness to facilitate things happening, being open to trying new things, taking risks, doing some experimentation, et cetera. And these are all the ingredients that are necessary typically to make a strong work of art. So we just want to acknowledge that about the dynamism of Lehigh University. So thank you very much for that. And that's my version of so-called prepared remarks. I have a little bit more of a folksy way of doing artist talks. I'm going to start by sharing a few projects with you to give you a little bit of the sense of the arc of my work. I've been an artist. I got my MFA in 1991. I've probably done about 35 major projects in 10 countries, and I'm only going to show you maybe 4, I haven't counted, but maybe 4 or 5, and then close by talking about Starstruck, which you're going to see in the gallery shortly. But in any case, in such public talks, there's always the issue of how do I curate what I present? Which projects do I choose? And I wanted to share with you that today, or in the last days, in thinking about this talk, I selected projects, many of which shared something in common with Bethlehem, whereby they were sort of post-industrial situations where industry had collapsed, and then they're kind of an economic apocalypse and social apocalypse followed, and then the community eventually reinvented itself. So I use that as one of the guiding frames for what I was going to show you tonight. I work in a variety of different media. In art school, I studied photography, but it was very fluid. The difference between a still image and a moving image and an installation, these were all sort of continua of the same kind of activity. My first project after art school, which Aviela mentioned, the writing on the wall, it's always incumbent upon me to show that piece, because that's where it all started. What you're looking at is a color photograph that I took of a building in one of Berlin's former Jewish quarters, of a black and white photograph of what used to be located there in 1930. So this is a color photograph of a projection, a slide projection of a former Hebrew bookstore that was located at this address in, I believe that was 1930. So I created these installations and I photographed them. If you see the photographs in a museum or gallery, you say it's photography. If you're on site, you say, oh, this is an installation or this is a public project. I'm somebody who believes that ideas can live in more than one form as long as they do so effectively in each. So, and they had very sort of deadpan clinical titles, just the address, Amstadtstraße 7, slide projection of former Hebrew bookstore, Berlin, 1930, 1992, when I did the installation. I don't want to date myself, but there you have it. Police raid on former Jewish residents. This was not, this neighborhood in East Berlin, the Scheunenviertel, maybe some of you have been there, and it looks nothing like this today. This is from the early 90s, it's before it was gentrified. But it was not the neighborhood of German Jews, it was the neighborhood of Polish and Russian Jewish immigrants, typically rather poor people economically. And so this was an immigration raid in 1920. Slide projection of former Jewish resident. And, you know, as you might imagine, the responses of local residents to seeing these projections of former residents of their buildings or former shops that used to be located there was sometimes quite interesting and memorable. But we don't we were focusing on other projects tonight, but I just wanted to say in the Q&A, if you're curious, you could ask about that. Slide projection of former Jewish residents. On the left there, that's Berlin Alexanderplatz in East Berlin. That was the former, like, the television tower / spy and surveillance center of the former East German government. Was der Krieg verschonte, that's the graffiti, right? The whole sentence is, was der Krieg verschonte, überlebt im Sozialismus nicht. What the war spared did not survive socialism. So remember, this project was done shortly after the wall came down. So there's all these layers of German history going on here. Pre-war history of the war itself, post-war socialist history, the DDR, the East German government of when it was in existence. And then after the wall came down, this graffiti that was put up into this sort of rich sediment is one layer, which is my slide projection of former Jewish residents, in this case children. Slide projection of former religious book salesmen. Slide projection of former Jewish cafe with residents. The light flare is not from my projector. It was from a street light. The photographer in me saw it and liked it and let it be there. So you sort of have to visualize the setup of this, because, you know, in a certain way, I want to say I come from guerrilla art. You know, this is not from Photoshop. This is pre-Photoshop. It's not a digital collage. I'm on the street, across the street from these buildings with my slide projectors, and they were slide projectors in that day. They were that Kodak, you know, you can't make it up. Those Kodak, the ring carousel projectors, a generator, and my camera equipment. And if you walk by, you look at me, I wave at you. You look the other way, you see the projection on the building. I just want to make sure that you sort of understand what I was doing. So, you know, I lived in Europe for most of the 90s, did several projects there, and then the lovely Ann Pasternak, who is now the director of the Brooklyn Museum, but back then was the director of Creative Time, that I only just learned today that William Crow had the opportunity to work with, which I had no idea about that. Anyway, I was living in Berlin, and she approached me and said, hey, Shimon, would you like to do your first big public project in America? And around that time, I wanted to move back anyway. So what resulted, what resulted is a project called Between Dreams and History. Now, I've already should have heard some audio with that. I don't know why. Let's just see.
In some
Yes.
ways, most wonderfully, when it gets to the synagogue, it's going
Shimon Attie is preparing to make his mark on Manhattan. Over the last 4 months, he's talked to residents about their memories of the neighborhood, as well as their own stories, superstitions, and dreams. He spent more than 2 years planning a laser art installation that will take place here in the heart of the Lower East Side, an area influenced by generations of Jewish, Hispanic, and Chinese immigrants.
I very much respond to spaces and to places, and by temperament, I'm very interested in memory. And how do we give visual form to something so, on one hand, so intangible and ethereal, but on the other hand, something very real for us.
Shimon found his answer with lasers. Words made of light scroll across the architecture in real time, moving from building to building. Fragments of thoughts, poems, songs are all made visible on the street, some in English, others in Yiddish, Mandarin, or Spanish, the languages of this community. It's a major art project that required a lot of coordination and backing.
We couldn't imagine a better marriage for public art.
That's Ann Pasternak.
Stunning the public with great visuals and providing them with content that was incredibly thoughtful and appealing.
Shimon says that the lasers help animate his project.
The quality of laser light mirrors how memory itself functions. Lasers, they're very intense light, very focused, so they appear to have a presence. And yet, after all, it's just a light source. It's much more like a ghostly kind of writing, as if a ghost is writing out of thin air. That's the visual effect that I wanted.
This is high-tech public art at its most public. Anybody, it seems, who walks through this neighborhood and sees this art installation ends up staying.
Some of the things, are very touching, like someone saying that they live so poorly in a tenement, and the conditions were so bad. And I know that these people come. This population has grown up in this area and have come from bad times.
And this is really a wonderful change, the fact that you could display something in art in a very simple form and in a very easy form, I think, and people could see it in a very clear and in a very beautiful manner. I think it's wonderful.
I think it's going to cause a lot of the people that live in the community to just look differently at the buildings that they live in.
For 2 centuries, this part of Manhattan has been home to many different groups of immigrants, but that's changing as affluent young professionals move in. But Shimon Attie hopes his laser art will help keep the older memories alive. Damien Fowler, BBC News, New York.
It's always a little bit of a challenge to see myself in video, but that's my own private issues you don't need to know about. So this is a project I normally probably would not have shown tonight, except for the shared post-industrial legacy and history. It's a project that I did with a Welsh village in the south of Wales called Aberfan. And if there's any British folks in the audience over a certain age, that's all I would need to say. Because it's equivalent to in the United States when somebody says, if you're old enough, can you remember when John F. Kennedy was assassinated? Or can you remember where you were? Or the circumstances under which you heard? And you do. And what happened in Aberfan was a kind of it's a national scar and trauma for the British nation. It was a coal mining village, very working class, and there was an avalanche related to coal mining, long predicted, man-made, kind of like a Welsh Pompeii. The avalanche came sliding down the mountain, and then what they call the slurry, the kind of the wet coal waste soup, it re-solidified when it went through the village's only elementary school. So the village became famous for having, famous in quotation marks, of course, for having lost all of its children, because it was the only school in the village. So that was the initial trauma, and then they have been harassed by the worldwide news media ever since. I was looking for the right word, and I think that's the word they would sign on to. Every major anniversary, the footage from the day of the disaster is rebroadcast on British television, or the photographs are republished, and the news crews descend on the village and approach people with microphones, and what was it like to lose your kids? Very, very intrusive, and the village felt like they were never really able to move on. So these are a couple of images from the day of the day of the disaster. There's the avalanche. And I was approached to see if a contemporary artist could do something different with the village that would be different than what the media does, and might be perhaps forward-looking in some way, broadly defined. And for 2 years, I said, no, thank you. I thought it was I just thought, like, why me? It just seemed a little off-color. Like, why not a Welsh artist? And as it turned out, they brought me along. You know, they invited me for multiple, like, small trips. As I did here in Bethlehem, I did, multiple trips to Bethlehem as well. But I was a go from the beginning. But with this one, it was tougher. And I got to know the villagers. And even today, I mean, the air is very thick with the disaster. Like I don't mean literally, I mean sort of metaphorically, emotionally, psychologically. But then I noticed that the village was full of all of these characters, these personages, these eccentric types. And I thought, well, why can't Aberfan be entitled to the same Welsh tropes, different personages as any other Welsh village, at least in the realm of the imaginary or the artistic imagination? I created a 5-channel video installation with the villagers. Let's just see what's going on here. It opens with a poem that I co-wrote with the national poet of Wales.
And refuses to stay still.
Moment. Okay. Is it playing? It is.
Life stops for a moment and refuses to stay still. I live in a different time from the world. I see them watching me. Here, not here. Now, not now.
And then the piece begins. You're only going to see one channel right now, so you can see it a little more clearly. In the actual piece, they're projected about 8 feet tall in high definition. And I filmed the villagers basically portraying themselves. There's no digital effects. So she's holding a static pose on a rotating plinth. She sees herself as the dancer of Aberfan, and the villagers see her as the dancer of the village. And in the actual piece in high definition, you can see like she's quivering, her eyes will blink or she quivers a little bit. And this is just a little bit of the center channel. I filmed about 40 villagers. I had to live in the village to make the piece. This is one of there were 6 kids that survived when they were lucky. There was an air pocket or whatnot. He's the mayor. Of the 6, three of the 6 are in the piece. This is a woman who lost 2 children. She's a minister. She's the minister of the village. Welsh villages are a bit like, let's just say that it's quite sectarian. It's a tiny village, and I think there's 35 churches. I was going to say a bit like my folks. I mean, Jewish people, but never mind. No, Shimon, no, don't go there. So now, and then she's a child. She's a current elementary school student. But what I wanted to say, every Welsh village has a boxer. So you have to understand, I was intentionally borrowing stereotypes or tropes. And I wanted to help to thaw how the village was, and oxygenate how the village is represented, that it's not only the disaster. But of course, I didn't want to deny the disaster either, so the musical score is a little bit somber at times. Every Welsh village has a South Asian shopkeeper. So then the question becomes, well, okay, Shimon, this is kind of interesting, but why did you film them as rotating statuary? Why this visual strategy? And the reason I did this is because it reflected my sense of trauma, that when we are traumatized, we freeze, but the freeze is never complete because the forces of life keep moving. So a moving stillness. And like Bethlehem, I mean, later there was complete economic collapse because Thatcher, then later, this was in 1966, but in the early 80s, Margaret Thatcher, the late British Prime Minister, she closed the coal mines, you know, those famous, the strikes with the miners. So they lost their economy, they lost the main industry in town. And it's been kind of a long climb back. I mean, obviously they're doing much better now. Some of it's through IT. Let me just move along. This is a more recent project, Facts on the Ground, that I realized in Israel and Palestine. Most places where I've worked, I have a personal connection with. I've either lived there or my family comes from there. The Wales project was a bit different, which is maybe why it took me 2 years to do it, to say yes. And by the way, there's a BBC documentary about the making of that piece. It's called, ironically, it's called An American in Aberfan, based on An American in Paris. I think they were trying to be cutesy. But it's good at showing the making of that project and some of my hesitations, and what brought me around. And then the interactions with the people of the village and how they felt being in the artwork, what they felt when they saw it it premiered at the National Museum of Wales. This is a recent project, Facts on the Ground, very DIY, like my Berlin project, do it yourself. Not high tech, not big technical crews, usually just me plus one person helping me carry equipment. This was a series of site-specific light box pieces or installations. I created about 30 of them, maybe 40 across Israel and Palestine. Site-specific can be it's a term that's sort of flavor of the month type term. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Let's just say installations that that are responses to specific sites and would be less effective if they were just moved somewhere else. So this is at the edge of an Israeli settlement in the West Bank, and it's called Wild and Urgent. And there's a generator off camera powering these. And this is a project, by the way, that I made it largely in order to be photographed. So the resulting photographs is the central part of the artwork. Unlike Euphoria, this is where the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin of Israel was assassinated in Tel Aviv for trying to make peace with the Palestinians in 1995. Landlord, we're at the edge of a Palestinian village looking onto an Israeli settlement. Excuse me. All of one's fears. On the left is a mosque, that orange building, it's actually orange lighting on the building, are the ruins of a mosque, basically an archaeology site. And on the right is what is a synagogue. And then my intervention, all of one's fears. I was trying to reflect, the psychologists call it negative projective identification. I become your worst fear, and then in response to that, you become my worst fear. And then it's like a race to the bottom. A problem in logic. That's the Israel-Palestine separation wall. When I was a youngster, I lived there, and I was very dented and troubled by the conflict. So this is another one of my community-based works, The Crossing, which one person in the audience is very familiar with, Ms. Clem, because we showed it at the St. Louis Art Museum, and they acquired it for their collection. It's a single-channel art film that I made with 7 Syrian refugees who had recently arrived in Europe on rafts over the Mediterranean. And there's no digital effects, and they had no performing or acting experience. Many of them had arrived just weeks before the filming. And I had this idea. I was commissioned by a government in Europe to make a new piece, whatever I wanted. And it was one of those European microstates that had a history of the casino industry, like where James Bond films have been filmed. So I had this crazy idea that I wondered if the casino game of roulette had in any way was an apt metaphor or distillation for the experience of being a refugee in terms of navigating the forces of life and death that are outside of one's control. And I asked them what they thought. They said, Shimon, this is our entire life experience. Let's do it. So we did the film. It's just, I think, about 8 minutes long. 7 refugees around a roulette table. And they played this kind of symbolic casino game of roulette. I say symbolic because they're not literally playing a game from beginning to end in real life, but for the film they are. But what happens is that slowly, we start with 7 people, but slowly, one person disappears from the table at a time, and we never see them leave the table. It's going to get loud just for one moment. So he's going all in. And when I work with traumatized communities, I often film them with a lot of emotional restraint, almost like their poker face. And I do that for a reason, which is basically to safeguard their right to be opaque and their interiority. We think we know how people in such circumstances feel, but we often don't. So I deliberately try not to hand over the emotional goods that we're expecting or wanting. So the piece proceeds. I mean, I'm not going to show it all to you now. So now we're down to 5 people. And there's no slow motion effects. We're just filming things. They do things slowly. I was trying to sort of reflect how when we are forced to flee for our lives, we never do it with joy, number one, and we kind of go into an automatic pilot just to survive. So that's what I was thinking about, and of course I talked to them about it, and they thought it was very apt. So now we're down to maybe 4 people, now we're down to 3, 2, my father's family was from Syria, so that was a little helpful in terms of making an initial connection and them smiling at my humiliating Arabic. my few butchered words that I can say from growing up. And then the last man standing, sitting. We don't know if the others won or if they lost. It's deliberately ambiguous. And this is, oh, no. Sorry. Oh, that's, well, fine. You said, that was, actually, I do want to go back to that. Sorry, but that was important. There. That's where I want to be. I often use dedications, but I always put them at the end, never at the beginning. I sort of believe in sort of backfilling the content, and so that the experience leading up to that is more open-ended, and then people get surprised. To learn, for example, that all 7 people in that film were refugees who had gambled their lives by trying to come to Europe. Sometimes I present it as a immersive installation, but that requires ceiling projectors also to bleed certain parts of the film into the space so that you're in it rather than looking at it. This is a more recent piece. Some of you might have, it got a lot of press on the East Coast, also on PBS. It's a floating media installation that I created in the waterways around New York City, the Hudson River, the East River. And then more recently, it went to San Francisco Bay, which was thrilling for me because I'm from San Francisco. It was a barge with a large LED screen on it, playing a 9-minute silent looping film of what I call 12 new New Yorkers, people whose lives were literally saved by being granted political asylum in the United States in recent years. So you can see there's many sort of links in my work between community, memory, history, trauma, public space, and technology. These are not still images on the screen. Well, you'll see in a second. So this was presented in New York City during UN General Assembly Week over 8 consecutive evenings when the world leaders were in town. A young man from Kazakhstan, a gay man who fled Kazakhstan because of discrimination there and threats to his life. Each of these people have they might look young and beautiful, but they have horrific stories of survival. And they all live in New York. They have, some of them own businesses. There are neighbors. She was a judge in Russia, and she uncovered a corruption scheme among government officials, and they told her that if she didn't flee the country, they were going to kill her and her daughter. So she fled and asked for a political asylum in the U.S. There she is. And now, just a short little clip from the film itself that's projected, that's displayed on the screen. It opens with a quote from James Baldwin: "We contain the other, hopelessly and forever." And I'm just going to, as you can see, the production value is a little bit better with this way. So one at a time, they would just approach in a black void from the distance. Approach the camera, and by extension, the viewer on shore, and look. They're looking at us, we're looking at them. They're looking at us, and we're looking at them. and again, very emotionally restrained. I strongly believe in making art that might raise more questions than it answers. This is a woman from Honduras. She was an unaccompanied minor at the border when she was apprehended by ICE. I forget how old she was at the time of filming, maybe like 13. There's a lot of, there was different television reports and documentaries about this project, and it's very beautiful when you see her, when she's on the shore, and you see her response to seeing herself on the screen as the barge goes by. It was very emotional and a beautiful moment. For the millions who've been forced to flee their homelands to escape violence and discrimination, for the fortunate few who've been granted political asylum in the United States. 12 of these individuals appear in this piece. And as you can see, I go back and forth between working in public spaces and working within museums and galleries. I sort of don't register, it's almost like the frame or the border between them, for some reason, doesn't exist within my artistic engine. They seem all the same to me. They seem all the same to me, for better or for worse. Oh, this is just for fun. It was just, as I said, it was recently in San Francisco. It was resurrected and represented. And this is where I went to art school, and this is where I come from, so it also had a kind of a personal. There's the Golden Gate Bridge. This is time does fly. This is late September of last year. The music is not part of the piece. And it was very interesting seeing the difference of the Bay Area response to the New York response. Again, in the Q&A, if you want to ask, you can. I just want you to see Alcatraz. There we go. So both in New York and in the Bay Area, I was very aware of architectural landmarks that were not only iconic in general, but that also resonated with some of the content in the piece. We can just go through these. As I said, I come from photography, so I often photograph my installations if I feel that the situations are sufficiently photographic, meaning that there's the possibility that maybe the photograph can stand on its own and have some aesthetic power after the installation is over. And of course, one of the things I love about photography is that you can frame relationships for the human eye that we might not normally do on our own if left to our own devices on site. There's the woman you just saw, the girl. And this is the reason we're here tonight. Starstruck. Let me first do two disclaimers. One is that this is the first time I've ever spoken about it, because it's a brand new work. So I suspect in 6 months from now, I will hopefully be a little more coherent, because I'll have had time to reflect on it. And two is that you're about to see the piece in person next door. So I'm not showing you the piece itself. I'm just going to talk a little bit about its making. I was very fascinated by Bethlehem. The more I came to know of Bethlehem, the more fascinated I became. all I knew was the history, well, a bit about Bethlehem steel, which is what most Americans would probably say if you ask them what they know about Bethlehem. I didn't know about the Moravian founding in 1741 as, founding of the town to be the Bethlehem of North America. I was aware of course, the 100-year reign of Bethlehem Steel and the industrial heyday, and then the collapse of the local industry, as happens so much across what we now call the Rust Belt. And then I had no idea that Sheldon Adelson, the late Sheldon Adelson, had come in and bought up part of Bethlehem Steel and turned it into a gambling casino. So these layers were very interesting to me and fascinating and curious and kind of singular. And this is not even to mention other aspects like the present day community in terms issues related to race and police, Black Lives Matter, issues related to COVID and a state of medical emergency. I say this because this was sort of in my artistic soup also when I made the piece, and you'll see that next door. So what we did is it's a 2-channel video with a sculpture in the middle. The video component was based on these key iconic sites in Bethlehem. You live here, so you know these sites, the Star on the Hill, the steel stacks. This is the sanctuary of the Central Moravian Church, the tannery building down by the river, the Moravian tannery in the colonial industrial quarter. Did I get that right? I think that's what it's called. Okay. And then there's key people who I thought distilled different aspects of this history. And sometimes we would see these people in the film where you would expect to see them. A nurse practitioner in a hospital hallway, a Moravian woman being framed by the Bethlehem Star behind her, former steel worker at the steel. Of course, we had our own cinematic lighting. I like things to look beautiful. I mean, I am an artist. A gospel singer who's also a member of the Moravian Church. And then we see these folks in the film where we don't expect to see them. Here's the nurse practitioner at the steel stacks. The former steel worker, is in the sanctuary of the church. And here he is again at the Bethlehem Star. And here is a blackjack dealer dealing a deck of cards. He's actually the one person who, he was not really he's not a blackjack dealer in real life. We tried to get access to employees at the casino, but that didn't go anywhere. So that was one where we had to be a little literary. African-American woman lives in Bethlehem at the steel. So those are little teasers about the video, which is going to be revealed to you shortly. And then the star, there's a sculpture in the middle of the video, 2 video channels. It's a mixed media piece. It's all one piece. The star component, it was inspired by the Bethlehem Star, which all of you know. 90 feet tall, there it is, visible for 60 miles at nighttime in every direction. It emits a white, like a Moravian Christmas white in color. It was built not by the Moravian community, but by the Bethlehem Chamber of Commerce, I think in 1936 or 37, as a way of sort of commercially branding the city as the Christmas city. So I was thinking about that and struck by that, and my idea was to actually have a replica, an exact clone of the star fabricated, but the gallery ceilings here next door are 12 feet tall, and this is a 90-foot star. So our star for the artwork is 11 feet tall. We worked with architecture and engineering students, I believe, who went up to the hill and did CAD drawings that were the basis of the fabrication with the design lab. Some folks are here today. I said I shouldn't start thanking people because it's not going to stop. So these are CAD drawings of the star. And so we spent about a year none of this stuff happens quickly. Fabricating an 11-foot star, except one more item. Yes, there's Professor Brian Slocum, who I think might be in the audience, who sort of oversaw the physical fabrication of the star. But the lighting of the star was jerry-rigged to alternate between being kind of like a white Christmas star on the hill versus the colors of a Wheel of Fortune, a hybrid between something sacred and something profane. You're going to see this star, this ill-behaved star shortly. This is just a little excerpt. And so it alternates between the videos being on and doing their part, and then they turn off and hand off to the star. And all of the music in the piece is Moravian. These are just some production stills, just showing you the kind of behind the scenes, the making of. And we're very happy to say, largely with William Crow's support, that we're publishing a monograph of the project with Black Dog Press in London. That's coming out in, 6 to 9 months from now. And this is just sort of the front and back cover. And there you have it. So thank you very much. So if we can get the lights up a little bit, I have no idea what time it is. I hope I was reasonably okay. What time is it? Are we okay? 10 minutes. Okay, so 10 minutes of Q&A or conversation. That's a little bright, but hey, I can always put on my sunglasses. No, I didn't bring sunglasses. So if you have any questions or comments about any of I shared with you four or five different projects. Anything you're curious about or observation or response you want to share, feel free. Is somebody raising their hand? Hi. Well, it's a very good question, and it's always one of those things with artists, because we often think that we think in terms of binaries like form or content, right? And first and foremost, I want to make things that are beautiful to look at, right? Because I'm not an activist, I'm not per se, or I'm not a historian. I'm an artist, so I try to work with. I'm getting this. I am answering your question, but it might be a little longer than one would ideally hope for. No, it'll be okay. Don't worry. So first of all, I'm trying to make something beautiful, and one of the powers of art, one of the things that's unique about art, as opposed to, let's say, maybe education or history, is that it's not focused on transmitting information. It's focused maybe on providing the opportunity in the viewer to experience something they're already familiar with in a new way. So that's what I aim for and what I hope for. Now, in terms of the particulars, of, why do I make art that deals with social history or communities, as opposed to, let's say, another artist who might be fascinated by the color red and make red paintings. They're both content. Those are both content, and they're both subject matter. These are simply things that I care about. Maybe I'm old-fashioned and a little out of style, but I feel like life is a little too short to make art just about art. I feel it should have I feel an urgency around art having a connection to real, lived and felt lives and making a difference. Sounds really corny, but this is how I'm wired. So, but I share this with probably every other artist, including some of you in the room. I make work about things that I care about, and it's hard to make art. So you have to kind of reach a certain escape velocity, because especially my projects can take a year or two of my life. So it's like I don't do it lightly. So it better be something where I'm like really invested in the subject matter. No, I'm going to do a better job at looking around the room this time. I don't think of people in Bethlehem as being so shy. That hasn't been my experience. Yes?
You mentioned earlier about the original star being 90 feet tall and you couldn't reproduce that.
Mm-hmm.
Given the space constraints in there and the fact that you had to make the star smaller,
Mm-hmm.
did that drive part of what you ultimately produced, or was there other ideas that you had that you wish you could have done because of the space?
That's an excellent question, and that's a really good question. The answer is basically no. It didn't. The issue of scale didn't dramatically change the concept. The heart and soul of it was, in fact, this tension between white light and Wheel of Fortune light. I mean, it doesn't take rocket science to interpret that, right? I will say, however, that there was something early on related to scale, which was there was a fork in the road. When I was appointed to be Horger Artist in Residence, there was an openness to maybe I would just do a project in public space, or maybe I would do a project in the gallery. Probably I wasn't going to do both because there wasn't time and resources for that. But there was a fork in the road, because there was a period where I thought about doing a really large star, maybe not 90 feet, but maybe 30 feet tall, 50 feet tall, somehow installed somewhere across from the Bethlehem star and in visual dialogue with it. And I ultimately decided not to do that because that would have, it could have been fun, but it would have been a lot of stuff around engineers and permitting, and it just wouldn't have been so much fun, actually. So, yes? How important is the audience? Right. The audience for me is everything, because I do see art making as a form of communication. Not every artist feels that way, but so to be a form of communication, there needs to be a receiver. And even the example you gave of the desert, right? Remember, I made that project in order to photograph it. So the audience was later the people who would see the photographs or the book that came from that. That was the audience for that project, even if there weren't so many people on site. And you're right, there often were not so many people on site.
A follow-up to that about the specifics of your audience. So it's almost, I had a group of first-year students in there, none of whom were from the Bethlehem area, and it seems that you have a sense of duty first and foremost to the community that you're representing. And kind of follow up her question, is that the number one priority then? How outsiders might see it might be a little bit different.
Well, this is always a tension, and in the canon, right, of contemporary art, there's since I was in art school, I'm not going to tell you how many decades ago that was, but let's say for the last significant chunk of time, there's always been this sort of argument in terms of who has the right to speak for whom. right? And, you know, related to identity politics and other issues. But it's very interesting because, just to give you one example, in the case of the Welsh project that I shared with you in Aberfan, I felt like, I just felt that it wasn't appropriate almost for me to do that project because I wasn't Welsh and I wasn't native to that experience. And what ended up happening is they didn't buy that. The villagers did not buy that. Sorry for that. And they said, no, Shimon, it's actually precisely because you are an outsider and you do have some distance in order to have a lens to interpret through, as opposed to this. So just to say that, like many things in life, these kinds of issues are much more complicated, and there's a lot of ambiguity in them than would appear at first glance. But it is something I think a lot about. I'll just say one more thing about that, which you didn't ask me about directly, but I should probably stop when the going is good. But the goal isn't always to make everyone in the room happy. You know, that's one of the pitfalls of public art, right? Just when everyone in the room has a consensus and is nodding their heads, yes, we all like this, we all agree, this is all really, really good. Usually that's when you have your worst piece of art, right? So all of these things need to be taken, even, you know, the community, the social engagement, all of those boxes that we like to check, everything should be held loosely, in my opinion, because there's different currents that go in opposite directions. One last question? Yes. Oh, hi, Meg. Yes. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You guys are asking really, really good questions. It was a guerrilla project. There was no advance. It was my first project after art school. I was like a freshly minted MFA. I had no budget. I had no organization supporting me. People would just discover the projections by pure happenstance. I don't know that it wasn't, how do I say this? The fact that it was guerrilla wasn't central to that was by necessity, right? Since I was doing it myself and I was producing it myself. So it wasn't because of some ideological preference for guerrilla or not guerrilla. And then the responses of the residents. The first monograph that came out of my work was about that project, and it was called The Writing on the Wall. And there were 3 essays in the book, and I wrote one of them, and it was focused entirely on the responses of the community. I'll just close by saying, I don't do things to get a reaction. Like, I'm not instrumental in that way with art. I may get, and in fact, I may get many reactions, but that's not why I'm doing them. I don't do A to make B happen, because then what have you done to art? And then how do you even measure whether or not you achieved that goal? I hope that I'm working in an arena whereby people can be moved and experience things differently, and maybe even sometimes have a sense of wonderment. All at the same time as engaging different kinds of content. So I think that does it. So I want to thank you all very much again for your attention, and I invite all of you to come next door to see the piece in the Rill. I just showed you some, down-res documentation, but the Rill Megillah is next door. It's 19 minutes long. Thank you. Thank you.
And as Shimon said, please join us next door in the galleries for a reception, not only to view Shimon's piece, but also our lower gallery. We have works from the permanent collection, as well as about 25 undergraduate students that are leading conversations about works of art. So I hope you'll engage them in dialogue. So I'll see you next door. Thanks, everyone.